So there are a lot of definitions of evil. Mine is, it's about power. Evil for me begins with the exercise of power to intentionally harm other people psychologically through discrimination, through prejudice, through rumors, to hurt physically through torture or beating up, to destroy mortally, to kill. And most evil is really done not by people but by systems, by governments. And there it's to commit crimes against humanity. Now, I'm going to talk about the situational forces, as Dacca alluded to, and I'm going to describe some of the research I've done and my colleagues have done, which says we have underestimated the power of situations to transform good people and move them across that line. So I want to begin with a case study of evil, because evil is this vague thing. Everything is evil. A few years ago, we all saw on television these horrific scenes of American men and women soldiers brutalizing, degrading, humiliating prisoners under their control in a strange place called Abu Ghraib in Iraq. When those pictures were shown, the Bush administration, military administration said, this is the work of a few bad apples, a few rogue soldiers. It's not systemic. Okay? Now, you know it's a lie because they can't say it's not systemic without having done an investigation. They couldn't do that in the hour after the films were released. But this is a documented case of evil. Now, I looked at these and I said, hey, I have seen these same pictures, similar, in the Stanford prison experiment, which I did 30 years earlier. Prisoners stripped naked with bags over their heads, guards sexually abusing the prisoners. And so I said, maybe the soldiers were good and maybe it was the barrel that was bad. Because as you'll see later on when I describe the Stanford prison study, we knew on day one, we went to great lengths to only have good apples put in the bad barrel that we created. And so I went on NPR and made this media soundbite. It's the good apples, bad barrel. And the lawyer for one of the guards heard this and said, would you like to be on a defense team? I said no initially because what they did was horrific. He said, but you could get the data to answer your hypothesis. You could interview him, you could have him tested, you could have access to all the pictures, there's more than 1,000, and you could have access to all the investigations by generals and others. So I couldn't resist, I did it. So how do psychologists understand such transformation of human nature? If you assume at time one, the guy I know, Chip Fredericks, was a good guy, was an exemplary soldier, had 9 medals and awards, had not a single negative thing I could trace in his whole life, and now he's doing this really bad stuff. The basic way that we all think, it's got to be something about the people, about their genes, about their nervousness, about their personality. We call that dispositional, the bad apples. The situational is the external context. What was unique about Tier 1A on the night shift? We have to understand what was the environment that those soldiers operated in. And third is, who created that environment? So that's where we have to think about the systemic power. It's economic, cultural, legal, because it's the system that creates and maintains those bad situations. So this brings us very quickly to the Stanford Prison Experiment, which I did back in 1971. We didn't have money. We put just a small ad. We did want college students. These were students from all over the United States who happened to be in the Stanford area, just finishing summer school. 75 people volunteered for the ad. We gave them personality tests, interviews. We picked 24, everyone normal and healthy, good apples on day one. We put them in uniforms. We randomly said, you be guard, you be a prisoner. And we didn't tell them that. We just said, you wait for the study to begin. We had the guards come down on Saturday so they would feel they own the prison. And the kids who are going to be prisoners, we said, wait at home or in the dormitories, we'll pick you up. We didn't tell them that I had arranged with the Palo Alto Police Department to make very realistic arrests, as you'll see. Because we want the authorities to take away their freedom. Because then who gives it back? Only the authorities can. And if you're a prisoner, only the parole board can. So we didn't want them to say, I quit the experiment, willy-nilly. So this is what it looks like at the beginning.
A police car pulls up in front, and a cop comes to the front door, knocks, and says he's looking for me. So they took me out the door, they put my hands against the car. It was a real cop car, it was a real policeman, and there were real neighbors in the street who didn't know that this was an experiment. And there was cameras all around and neighbors all around. They put me in the car, then they drove me around Palo Alto. They took me to the police station, the basement of the police station. Then they put me in a cell. I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell, which was just like a room with a door with bars on it. You could tell it wasn't a real jail. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit. They were taking this experiment too seriously.
Indeed we were, and that was day one. So the prisoners, we're going to make them anonymous, dehumanize them. They become numbers. The guards are in military uniforms with symbols of power. And it began, as you saw in the first scene of Abu Ghraib. It always begins with that push-ups, jumping jacks, physical things. And one of the main motivations of evil is boredom. Our guards worked 8-hour shifts there. It was 12-hour shifts. You get bored. And how do you relieve boredom? By doing something new, something different. And you have to, once you do the thing, you have a masturbation contest. That was yesterday. Today we're going to pile them naked in a pyramid. So it forces you to move in. Once you've crossed that line, the only direction is more and more degradation, humiliation. And in fact, the same thing happened in Stanford Prison Study. Guards made them clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands, stripped them naked at any excuse. And then the kid you saw was the first one to get arrested. He had an emotional breakdown in 36 hours. We had to release him. And then he became a model, again, of how to get out. In 5 days, we had to release 5 kids. Kids we chose because they're normal and healthy. We're having emotional breakdowns because the guards had begun to be truly sadistic, enjoying their control and domination. So we had to end the study. So what are the real-world parallels very quickly? Here's our prisoners waiting to go to the parole board. Parole board was headed by an ex-convict with secretaries and ordinary people. Hoods, chained feet, waiting to be... And here's Iraq. Same hoods, only guards have much bigger guns. In our study, after 5 days, the guards began to sexually degrade the prisoners various ways, and you saw this picture of simulated fellatio. The British soldiers had prisoners simulate sodomy in their prison in Basra. It's what happens when men are put in these situations of power and dominance with no oversight. One of the investigations was by James Schlesinger, a former Secretary of Defense, but he had generals on his committee. He concludes with 2 things which are really important for psychologists. The potential for abusive treatment of detainees during the global war on terror was entirely predictable based on a fundamental understanding of the principles of social psychology coupled with an awareness of numerous known environmental risk factors. That's the situation. Findings from the field of social psychology suggest that the conditions of war and the dynamics of detaining operations carry an inherent risk. For what? For human mistreatment, and therefore must be approached with great caution, careful planning and training, but there was none. And then he goes on to say that psychologists have attempted to understand how and why individuals and groups who usually act humanely can sometimes act otherwise in certain circumstances. And then he says, the landmark Stanford study provides a cautionary tale for all military detention operations. They knew that. In fact, they used the principle of the worst abuses at Stanford happened in a night shift when the guards knew I was asleep and there was no surveillance. And that's why we think they only had soldiers on the night shift encourage them to do those abuses, and they never had any surveillance and oversight. And so nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer. Nothing is more difficult than understanding him. So what we try to do with Dacker's work, with my work, with other work of psychologists, with many of you, is we try to understand the underlying causes. And what's clear is understanding is not excusing. People who are perpetrators of evil are responsible always, even though we can say what extent their behavior, like Chip Fredericks, was attributed to the situation. He pleaded guilty. I said he is guilty, but the situational dynamics should have mitigated the severity of the sentence, and it didn't. He got 8 years dishonorable discharge. They took away all his medals, all his back pay. Not a single officer went to trial. Command complicity is if your subordinates engage in immoral, illegal behavior that you should have known about it, you are culpable. It went on for 3 months. Who was watching the store? And the answer was no one. So I'm advocating a switch away from the medical model, which is about the individual. We've got to get rid of that model and move to a public health model which says that we have to understand the vectors of disease, the vectors of prejudice, the vectors of violence in our society, the vectors of bullying. And it's only by developing that public health orientation that we can begin to develop procedures for preventing it.